Welcome to all our viewers joining us for the Earnscliffe Political Strategy Panel. My name is Kaveri Braid. I'm a managing principal at Earnscliffe based out of our Saskatoon office, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. Now, many of you who have joined us for this webinar before know that this is a monthly panel held on the first Thursday of every month, and it's a webinar where my colleagues get to tell you what they really think about the hot button issues that have been in the news in the last month. So let me introduce you to our panelists today. From our Ottawa office, we have our principal, Marianne Carter. Back again this month is Chris Ball, a managing principal in our strategic communications practice based in our Toronto office. And joining us from the Toronto office as well is our newest colleague, Principal Shak Chambers. Shakir, welcome to the Earnscliffe family. And then way out on the West Coast, we have our principal, Bruce Young, joining us from the Vancouver office. Welcome again to all our panelists. Now, before we start, I also want to encourage participation from our viewers. Please join in and ask the panel any questions you might have on the topics we are covering in today's webinar. And how you can do that is by simply using that chat function just at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Marianne, will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we will definitely be answering a few of them throughout this hour. So let's get started. Colleagues, the pandemic, of course, continues to dominate the news. And even though we're all in this together, it is most definitely a different situation depending on what region of the country you live in. For example, here in Saskatoon, Premier Scott Moe just released Saskatchewan's three-phase approach to start loosening restrictions in this province, which could actually come as soon as early June. In BC, some encouraging news this week as the third wave continues to decrease, but it's a different picture in Ontario as residents there are just past the halfway point of its 28-day province-wide lockdown. Chris, I'm going to get you to start us off. What's your assessment of the last few weeks of the Ontario government's handling of this lockdown?
Well, I think I'm going to resist the urge to just rage scream into the camera for the next 2 minutes. But I think what we're seeing right now is that there's some evidence that the lockdown, coupled with an aggressive kind of targeted vaccine campaign in hotspots, seems to be helping to get our caseloads under control. But what we've seen hasn't really been under control in the last few weeks is the gaslighting, deflection, and denials and bad politics over the last 2 weeks. So it all kind of started off with the government having to be dragged kicking and screaming on paid sick days, which is a measure that doctors and public health officials have been asking for since the first year of this pandemic. And after all of that back and forth, toing and froing, we got 3 days. That doesn't even match the average incubation period of COVID-19, which is between like 4 and 6 days, or the average quarantine, which is between 10 and 14 days. Calls for further measures to close non-essential workplaces were met with more kind of what I would term gaslighting about the border, which is, really doubling down on some kind of xenophobic dog whistling by calling it the Indian variant, making everybody scared of the other. When, let me remind our viewers that Ontario's problem is actually a community spread problem. Only 1.6% of spread is from the border. The B117 variant has been here since February, and yet we were reopening patios in March, and they ignored advice to close non-essential workplaces. So, the worst of it, I think, is just seeing the politics creep in here. The Ontario PCs are now running ads doubling down on this border fallacy to play up on people's xenophobia, and it's hurtful. And guess what? It doesn't actually fix the problem. The pandemic doesn't care about our politics. It doesn't care about their re-election. It doesn't care about deficits and tax cuts. It's a mindless killer whose win and loss is counted in bodies, not how many seats the next government wins. And what's going to win this for us isn't more politics. It's good public health policy.
Mm-hmm. Great points, Chris. Thanks. Marianne, let's talk vaccine rollouts. Great news yesterday with the news of Health Canada approving the Pfizer vaccine to children's ages 12 and up. More vaccinations are arriving weekly into Canada, but then we see sudden spikes in cases in parts of Atlantic Canada. What do you make of all of this? And are we hitting the mark when it comes to vaccine rollouts?
I think a lot of Canadians are frustrated, particularly those living in hot spots, like in parts of Toronto, around the area I live in. it's interesting because it demonstrates the complexities around our federation and the dynamics between the provinces and the federal government and how the provinces manage healthcare delivery. And it's interesting to see, Alberta came out and said as early as next week, people 18 and over will be able to access the vaccine. We're seeing improvements around the Greater Toronto area, wherein you have people who live in certain regions being able to get the vaccine, like Chris said, to manage community spread. But here in different parts of Ontario, in particular, and Quebec even, next week in Ontario, that's when the second group of eligible essential workers will be able to get the vaccine, including people who work in restaurants, people who work, in grocery stores, but even like paramedics and police officers who still do not have the vaccine. And so I guess the point of me saying all this, I think the pandemic has demonstrated the inequities on how the vaccines have been rolled out because the provinces have so much control on who gets what and when. And so I think for some people, it's quite frustrating when they live in hotspots and they're seeing their neighbors to the west or the east being vaccinated, and it's a particularly safe area. My gut feeling is we're going to we are going to turn to a turning point at the end of May, when most Canadians will have received their first vaccine shot. And I think the May long weekend will be a strong determinant on people's behavior and the outcome of that. But I think we have to hang tight for a couple more weeks to see how the political dynamics play out more broadly in Ontario, Quebec.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Shakir, let's talk about the international impact and the devastation we're seeing in India with the emergence of new variants. What do you think that means for securing Canada's borders?
Yeah, I think especially when you're seeing the emergence of the variant in India, I think a lot of countries, not just Canada, but internationally, are trying to impose restrictions or travel bans. I mean, the US, the UK, Germany, Singapore, it's a very long list of countries that are doing this. So Canada is not alone in terms of imposing restrictions. I think when you talk about securing the borders, though, there's just definitely a lot of criticism in terms of the restrictions that we have in place. There are reports last week and the week previous of people testing negative at the airport, coming into Canada, testing positive. There are obviously reports of people not following the quarantine when they actually come to Canada. So when you look at some of the criticism, despite of what Chris was saying, look some of the criticisms from Premier Ford or what the federal conservatives are saying about travel restrictions or the federal government's travel measures, I think people are just looking at a lot of these gaps and asking, why aren't you doing more, or why aren't bans enforced a little more aggressively? In the sense of, if your political leaders are saying to you, COVID is such a serious virus, it's very deadly, we're making significant sacrifices as our domestically, whether it's a lockdown or our own restrictions, I guess the view is, why isn't the federal government doing more? And I guess what Ford and I guess O'Toole is saying is that every time we do impose travel bans, we're a little late to the party, whether it's what started with China, whether it's with the UK, or whether it's with now with this new variant coming from India. And I think that's the push. I'm not so sure it's a xenophobic kind of direction they're going in. I think they just want stronger border measures, because even if it's less than 2% of cases that come from travel, that 2% still spreads exponentially. I mean, if you look at Ontario, what percentage of our cases now are variants, right? There's a high, I think it's, I'm not sure the final number, but it's 60 or higher than that, whatever the percentage is, but it's a very high percentage. And those are coming from somewhere. So I think that's where these leaders are coming from in terms of securing our border. That being said, I actually do understand the difficulty of a travel ban, right? If you are saying India's a hotspot, for example, and say the variant spreads to a UK or a Germany, does that mean you start banning flights from the UK and Germany as well? It becomes a slippery slope of implementing all these kind of travel bans to all these jurisdictions. But I think politically, governments need to act. I think domestically, our audience, the Canadian audience, they just won't be able to tolerate non-action, especially this deep into the pandemic, especially again, the seriousness that we associate with COVID. If you're saying to us, make all these sacrifices, then we expect you to go above and beyond to halt the spread or slow the spread until we can get Canadians vaccinated.
Okay, thanks, Shaq. Bruce, this week, the Prime Minister saw himself trying to navigate messaging after the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, or NACI, released their advice surrounding the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. What do you think? Was the Prime Minister successful with his messaging?
I think the Prime Minister and Dr. Tam and our own Dr. Henry in British Columbia largely got the messaging back on the road. And listen, the Prime Minister is led by example. He got the AstraZeneca vaccine on television for all of us to see. And so that's reassuring at a certain level. You know, NACI has been constituted since the early Pearson days. For 56 years, this volunteer group of scientists have provided advice and written reports, largely ignored by most of us. And now we're in a global pandemic and in a period where communications has fundamentally changed. I do not question their scientific integrity or experience, but it's obvious that they are not communicators. I'm not sure what was more entertaining, watching them make communication error after error, including going into hypothetical answers on power and politics, or watching a raft of communications professionals, politicos and ex-politicos and journalists piling on Twitter. But bottom line, I went and got the first jab that was offered to me, which was AstraZeneca. I encourage everyone to do the same, and it's good to see our Prime Minister leading by example.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. It was a bit of a mess this week, eh? Chris, I want you to get in on this, and I'm coming to you because, look, we've had discussions under the Earnscliffe roof on this topic. I heard you in a meeting earlier this week. I'm going to throw it over to you. What's your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should rename NACI not allowed to communicate indefinitely. And I think this really, like, people, yes, we should follow the science. Nobody is saying that we are impugning their science and their smart brains on this stuff. But I think if anything, this pandemic has taught us, there's so many things, but one thing is the huge value on strategic communications that governments and these other organizations need to place. This is a huge emphasis they need to place on it. So is the risk that they put forward an actual scientific risk? Sure. Do we need the doctor from NACI going on Power and Politics talking about a theoretical where she would be worried about her sister dying of thrombosis when the actual risk of that is so very, very low? I do take issue with the point that this is just political pundits and just communications people that are upset about it. Like the amount of text messages and emails that I've even gotten from friends who are way outside of this space that are like, okay, thanks, I just got my AstraZeneca first dose, like what does this mean? And I think it's still early for us to see kind of the long tail of this stuff. Like, what does this mean for second dose uptake? We saw in the United States, there's a huge screaming headline in the New York Times saying they're not going to reach herd immunity because a large proportion of people aren't getting their second shots. And part of that is because of contradictory messaging about the effectiveness and the risks of these vaccines. So let's tighten up the message. Let's get the strategic communications folks working, because they do know what they're doing. They're not a barrier. They're actually a help in this type of situation.
Yeah, agreed. Marianne, Shakir, any reactions here?
I mean, I would just echo the blatant frustration I think people have around not only people who haven't been vaccinated yet, but it's a public policy communications failure. And while I think it just demonstrates, looking to the future, and we know in political cycles and public health, sometimes we say, oh, that's down the road. It demonstrates the need to have long-term planning in terms of whether it's stockpiling and these sorts of committees. And I think there really does need to be a postmortem once we get a handle on this, not only in Canada, but globally, about if this is to happen again, and it will, or even, to the extent of a massive natural disaster, which we're not really, privy to in Canada, we need to be more prepared and more clear on what those steps are. And I think this week really highlighted the discrepancies in the plan.
Okay,
And,
thanks for that.
and your
Marianne.
Stratcoms people, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Nope.
Chris.
Go ahead,
I
Chris.
was just gonna say, like, like, I've been doing this for quite a while. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so your Stratcoms people aren't just the people who send out the press release. Like, these are the people that are literally like on the front lines of disaster time and time again, and actually trying to save organizations from themselves on multiple occasions, right? So I hope that this, and this is just another quick pitch, of that people start to kind of rethink the role of communications in the organization, that this isn't just the person in the corner who sends the tweets, the young person who, you know, manages my Facebook or my Insta. This is actually a strategic function that should be at the table, both in public policy and in corporate communications. And then I'll stop.
Okay, colleagues, before we leave this pandemic topic, I do want to get to the reaction from all of you in regards to this week's release of the Ontario COVID-19 Long-Term Care Commission report. It's a scathing report. The commission states that the ministry had no plan to protect residents from COVID and that the sector was insufficiently prepared for it. And the minister responsible admits that the slow pace of government bureaucracy was largely to blame. Panelists, I'm going to throw it wide to all of you. What do you think of the minister's response this week? Is it enough? Shakir, I'm going to go to you first.
I mean, is it enough? I think when you look at long-term care, generally speaking, their response is going to be, this is not a problem that they created, right? They've been in government for what, 2.5 years. These problems have long existed before they took office, so they shouldn't be holding the bag on what went wrong. But obviously, in the report, when they're saying they took no steps to kind of ensure this could be addressed, there's really no way around it. There's really no excuse for that kind of reaction. And I don't know how this plays out as we head into the election, but I think when you've seen a series of fumbles from this government in their pandemic response, long-term care is just something else the opposition is going to hold up and say this government is not competent enough to win the next election. And I'm not sure how they get around this particular issue. I think Minister Fullerton is going to be facing this one for months to come. And I'm not sure, even if they put policy proposals forth in the year ahead about how they're going to address it, I think they've lost the benefit of the doubt in terms of the public believing they're actually going to address this problem. I'm not sure how they get around this one moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. I saw you're nodding your head there.
Well, listen, I mean, I lived in Upper Canada for a decade, and I do my best trying not to focus on Ontario provincial politics. But I did note that a minister stormed out of a press conference this week on this subject, and that's probably not on message, and probably not the reassuring and compassionate tone I think they would want to hit. Certainly, I would want to hit if I was advising those folks. So it looks like it's a tricky file, and one that maybe isn't being handled in a way that provides reassurance to the voters.
Yeah, it was a bit of an awkward press conference, eh? Marianne?
Yes, I'd echo what my colleagues are saying, and it certainly goes back to my comments earlier about how the pandemic has revealed some of the serious flaws we have in our public health dynamics, and it's unfortunate. And it's not just Ontario, right? We saw really early on in the pandemic, Quebec, some really terrible, tragic stories, and throughout Canada. But I think at the end of the day, most Canadians or Ontarians don't want to see political finger pointing. These are real people. These are people's parents and family, and their needs. They need to get ahead of it. I think particularly in the messaging of we need to set our partisan politics aside and find a way forward to work with the various stakeholders who work in this space to ensure this never happens again.
Yeah, very good point, Marianne. Chris, the LTC report and the messaging after, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, anybody, like, I defy anybody to read that report and not just come away with a deep sadness. I mean, 37 seniors died because of failures of successive governments, mistakes made before and after and during the pandemic by this government. Like, 26 seniors died of dehydration. Like, they couldn't get a glass of water because of systemic failures in staffing. Like, just think about that for a second. And then the response, just like, we can talk about the process, obviously, like sending it out late on a Friday, like 7 o'clock on a Friday is pretty late, even for government standards who want to bury something. Giving a press conference about it 3 days later, then walking out of that press conference with media still waiting to ask questions. Blaming the opposition, who at the time and for most of their career has been the third party, and then having other ministers refer questions to the long-term care minister, who wasn't actually available to do media that day. Not only is that sort of a like huge communications failure, but I think it's also just a failure, like almost a moral failure in how we're addressing this. I mean, the least we can do for these families who now don't get to send mom flowers on Sunday, the least we owe them is the truth, right? And the least we owe, and that truth is going to lead to next steps, and that's going to lead to the solve, right? And sure, everybody should have egg on their face for this. And the government had an out to say, listen, this can't be fixed in the year and a half that we were in power by the time this pandemic hit and made things worse. But we're committed to fixing this, because that's the best that we can do for these families, right? And it's a matter of money and supporting PSWs and the people who care for our old folks as much as caring for seniors themselves, right? So anyway, the communications disaster of this is also, I think, a bit of a moral and political failure as well.
Yeah, very well said, Chris. Thanks for that. I think we have time for a viewer question. Marianne, do we have some questions?
Yeah, we have a couple. We'll start with the first one. Are governments just inherently bad at managing intensely complex events like pandemics? Do the right of center governments have a harder time of it due to pressure from their base?
Okay, who wants to tackle that one? Bruce, I know you've talked about this one before, you know, in the history of historically pandemics, right? What do you say to this?
I mean, governments are large and complex organizations for sure. And having been in many governments, it is very tough to get the beast to move in the direction you need it to. And sometimes governments succeed in making the beast move in the direction it needs to in a given set of circumstances, and sometimes they don't. What is always unhelpful, in my view, is ideology. There should be, and there often is, a practical element that casts a blanket over any political party that gets the privilege of governing a country or a province, by virtue of the fact that now you're governing on behalf of everyone and not just the group of people that voted for you and voted you into power. And so, you know, ideological decisions often lead you down unhelpful and detrimental rabbit holes. And so there's been successes and failures for all governments of all partisan stripes, whether it's provincial, municipal, or federal, in this you know, in this current round of pandemic. And you know, we haven't been perfect as a country in managing through this. It's been complicated by the federal system. But you compare us with other countries, and it sure does feel, at least, that you know, overall we've by and large tried to do the right things. There are examples, and people of different political perspectives will have different perspectives on how governments have performed, but there hasn't been a day, at least, and listen, I'm privileged to live in a detached home in Kitsilano, and so I acknowledge the good fortune that life has provided me, but there hasn't been a day where I haven't been grateful that I've lived in Canada throughout this whole mess.
Thanks for that. Shakir, I'll come to you. What do you think? Are governments just inherently bad at managing these kinds of complex events?
Yeah, I think I would actually focus on the notion of that the center-right governments being prisoners of their base and their ideology in terms of their responses. I do think when you look at, for example, whether it's Premier Ford or Premier Kenney and how they've handled this, they have gotten a lot of criticism, but I think they have tried to get to a kind of a balance between the public health aspects and the economic aspects. And I think when you try to find that balance, you're going to get criticized on both sides and everybody's going to be mad, right? And I think that's kind of where they've ended up. They can't make anybody happy because they're trying to make everybody happy, if you will. So I look at it in terms of as it was said to me, I've never seen a public policy decision where one kind of group, which is the public health group, have such an oversized influence, or really are the only voice that we should be listening to, and they shouldn't be questioned. And anytime you question public health advice, people look at you and say, where are your morals, or you don't believe in science. I'm not sitting here saying that the public health guidance is not the right guidance, but I do think in the environment we're in, we should be questioning the information or the directions that we're given. We should be asking, is this really the extreme restrictions we're being told to be put under? Are these the things we really need to be doing? And if the answer is yes, the answer is yes. But I don't think the center right governments are in some way just bad at handling pandemics, or at some way pandering to their base. There are the people with legitimate concerns about the restrictions and what they mean for the long-term impacts of the economy. And I think these center-right governments are trying to balance those two perspectives. As I said earlier, when you're trying to balance, you make nobody happy and you get criticized on both sides. I think that's what we're seeing with those particular governments.
Okay, Chris, any reaction to this?
Yeah, I think it's not just, I don't think it's necessarily a managing problem. I mean, we're seeing some of the effects of that, but it's actually a planning problem. So a lot of this stuff in disaster planning and public health planning, all this stuff kind of falls by the wayside within the cut and thrust of day-to-day government stuff, right? And you even see this at a corporate level. A lot of companies don't have that crisis management plan in the drawer, up to date and ready to go when something like this happens, right? And so, you know, it's putting a high priority on that pre-planning and that thoughtful, like, what happens if, and that gaming it out. We do this all the time with clients all the time about sort of like, let's go through a disaster scenario. Let's test where the parts that might fail are, and let's make sure that they're emboldened so it doesn't happen again. So it's as much of a managing thing, but I think you have to really pull it back to the pre-planning that tends to fall by the wayside. And public health isn't sexy before a pandemic, right? We saw cuts to public health across the board for successive governments. And so, you know, hopefully that changes that conversation. But, you know, public health and pre-planning is probably, that's a lot of P's, probably something that we should be investing a heck of a lot more in over the coming years.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, colleagues, I want to move on to the economy. Marianne, let's move on and take a look at the recent federal budget with approximately 270 separate spending provisions and over 100 billion in spending. It's ambitious. What's your overall take on it?
I think it was exciting time for politicos. We've been looking forward to this budget. We hadn't had one in 2 years federally, and it just sort of disappeared into the ether in the public domain and media spaces. I can tell you firsthand, and as our colleague Ellie has stated in a previous webinar, it's the Christmas tree budget. There's a ball or an ornament, something for everyone. But I think people and stakeholders, and certainly several of our clients, are still trying to wrap their head around it. And I think in terms of the broader public discourse, there's disconnect between understanding the mechanics of government around the Budget Implementation Act and what actually gets funded and supported in terms of programming, and if that will pass and what comes in fruition before the House of Commons breaks for the summer. And then how does that translate further if we're, for example, about to enter an election in the fall? And so while it's very ambitious, I think people were really happy to see things like big ideas around childcare, long-term care, you know, commitments to climate, and also just the recovery in general and support for small business. But on the other side, I think there's a number of Canadians that are very concerned about how we're going to pay for everything. And it's too early, Kaveri, I think, to state, you know, we had our budget panel a few weeks back. Until we go through the dynamics of leading up to mid-June and monitoring the Budget Implementation Act, and seeing what gets through and different things that people are looking forward to, that's where the juice is. And unfortunately right now it's a bit too early, but there's a lot of uncertainty still, and we're going to have to hang tight for a couple of more weeks.
Okay. I like how you said it's a Christmas tree budget. It's true, right? So Bruce, then can you confirm what everyone is already thinking? And that's, this is a pre-election budget with an eye for the federal government looking to potentially calling, an election either this summer or this fall. So would you agree with me? It's a pre-election budget, and will this budget get the votes the federal Liberals need?
Well, I mean, what I can confirm is that it's actually a post-election budget. We had an election, and this is the first budget since then. But laying aside the nuance, listen, I don't pretend to know anything. The job of any political leader, or a prime minister in particular in a minority parliament, is to have your political party ready for an election, because you don't know when an election ultimately is going to occur. Minority governments tend to last 18 months to 2 years. And so we are certainly within that window. If it was me calling all the shots, and it's not me calling any of the shots, I would certainly want the budget to pass. I would certainly want the 270 plus programs to be replete with money. And I would certainly want to make announcements over the course of the summer of exciting programs that are designed to support needy communities, important communities across the country, and to promote an inclusive economic recovery for all Canadians. That's what I would want to do. And, if things looked good by Labor Day, I would certainly think about it. But, there's no way of knowing. The obligation is to be ready, and then you pull the trigger whenever you think you have a chance, or in alternative universe, you're defeated on a particular measure. I don't think that that's going to happen. When the federal Liberals are consistently trending with a 6-point lead or higher, I don't think anyone wants an election at this point. So at least from the opposition benches, but we'll just have to wait and see. If I was a gambling man, and sometimes I am, and I've said this on previous panels, I would say I would slide a few chips across the velvet onto the fall. But what do I know?
You know a lot, sir. You know a lot. Shakir, so I do want to ask you, what are your thoughts about the level of spending we're seeing here in this federal budget? But, Bruce also talked about the opposition. I want to hear from you. Do you think Erin O'Toole and the federal Conservatives are positioning themselves properly for a rebuttal?
Well, I think they're positioning themselves the only way they can, right? They're the opposition. I don't think there's a realistic scenario where they're supporting all the measures in the budget. Even the rhetoric they're kind of putting out there, this is just more debt, more spending, not really focused on any priorities. You would anticipate them saying those kind of things. Western MPs are saying nothing for the oil and gas sector or natural resources sector. Very predictable responses. In terms of the way the Liberals are positioning it, though, I think it's a very smart strategy. Is it sustainable spending? I think anyone would agree on all levels of government. The spending that we've encountered during COVID is unsustainable. And I'm pretty sure the federal Liberals obviously realize that as well. However, is it advisable? I think politically, it's actually a very smart play. A lot of the spending priorities, a lot of the policy priorities, I would argue, kind of move them more to the left. And I think they're trying to crowd out that NDP space, that NDP kind of position, right? To kind of take over those voters. At the same time, when they're putting all these goodies in the window, if, as my panelists have said, if we're taking seriously that we could be heading into an election, the positioning can be, if you don't vote for us, you don't get these goodies. So if you're the Conservative Party and you're saying this is too much debt and it's too much spending, what exactly would you cut? And I don't think you want to head into an election talking about what you would cut from the previous government's policy, from the previous government's platform. So I think it's very good positioning. The only thing I would say that I would question with what the Liberals are doing right now is that they are really banking on the fact that in the very near term, Canadians want more spending. Canadians want new permanent programs that are not really COVID specific. And I'm not so sure Canadians are going to be there once we get out of COVID, once we're all vaccinated, once there's some kind of return to normal. There might be some kind of an appetite for some kind of fiscal responsibility. And I'm not sure this budget actually puts that in place. So if Canadians' view of a government spending, of new government programs starts to change, I'm not so sure how well positioned the Liberals are to kind of reflect that change in Canadian sentiment.
Okay, great points, Shak. So you raised, you said kind of puts them more to the left. So let's talk about the left. Chris, talk to me about the NDP. The leader, Jagmeet Singh, supported the Liberals' budget. How do you think this is playing out within the party and among Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some, vocal critics on the left of the party who may not be so satisfied with us supporting this budget, but I don't think it's really had any impact on our broader electoral fortunes. And actually, I think, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have actually better positioned than we've been in quite a long time. Like, if you look at there's like a recent Abacus poll, sorry, your competitor, but 4 in 10 Canadians are open to voting for the NDP in the next election. Jagmeet Singh is the only leader of the 4 parties with a net positive view from voters. From the mechanics of the party side, debts from the 2019 campaign are repaid, and we have now we're saying we're going to put forward a fulsome campaign that is going to match spending of our competitors. And I think, as Shak raised earlier, I think a lot of Canadians and folks just around the world after this pandemic do have a bit of renewed appreciation for the role of an activist government, right? And so the conditions are quite ripe for Jagmeet Singh and the NDP to kind of capitalize on this moment. And particularly, if we look at the electoral map itself, there's some opportunities, I think, growing in Quebec and in places in the 905 that could actually help that growth. But supporting the budget, it's actually within the NDP's frame this whole session, which is when you send more New Democrats to Ottawa, you get stuff done, right? And I think that's actually quite effective positioning for Jagmeet and the team at this point to say, you get more of this great stuff if we're in the House of Commons, folks, right? Like, that's a hard bet to bet against, right? So I'm not worried about the support of the budget, and I don't think the rest of Canada is, and I actually think it sets us up for success down the line.
Yeah, good points. Marianne, let's get to another viewer question. Do we have one?
We have several, and some are similar, but I think let's turn the page a bit and talk about something more focused on research and health. Why, in your opinion, did the federal government not provide direct support through the granting councils for basic research? Everything they provided is tied to something, for example, diabetes, dementia, etc., thereby preventing Canada's research community from developing the next technology that will help in the fight against the next pandemic. What is it going to take for governments to make long-term investments in research that will keep Canada globally competitive and innovative?
Great question. Yeah, who wants to take that one? What's it going to take?
I can kick it off since I work a bit in this space. I put on when I worked at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce hat, and one thing that's always been a frustration to me, and it's personal opinion, is I think sometimes we still, as Canadians, have this World War II narrative of ourselves of these like friendly, nice, we're part of the G7. We are a smart country. We're diverse. We're abundant with natural resources. But when you actually look at our level of competitiveness, whether it's in business, research, all sorts of things, we have the talent and the skill set, but we routinely fall to the middle of the pack globally. And part of it, I think, is a bit of our cultural dynamic on how we view ourselves, where in some respects, I think we actually have to be a bit more forthright and aggressive in let's be the best. And we've seen that, in a perfect example is Shopify. Shopify is a Canadian success story, but let us remind everyone that the only reason they are here and employing people outside of Canada and all parts of Canada is because the founder loves Ottawa. And so there's so much talent and success, especially in the research space, going to places like the United States because it's more expeditious to get IP, there's more spending dollars. And I think a lot of the times we are just too bloody slow, and we are very connected to at a bureaucratic level. Like, let's produce a 500-page report before we make a decision. And that's part of my issue when I'm seeing patient groups really struggling through the pandemic right now, because we can't support them in the way we need to, because we have these sort of entities that are so bureaucratic by nature. And so anyway, my point is that, like, there needs to be an actual, I think, political leadership on let's be the best, rather than, oh, well, we need to go through all these steps first, because it's not, at the end of the day, attracting more talent here, getting the best companies and investment here, when we could actually be on the global stage, but we just tend to sit back and say, oh, we're just 15th place, or we're just 30th place, and we're okay with that.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I see, Chris, you want to get in on this? What's it going to take for governments to do exactly what Marianne just said?
I don't know. I think, yeah, there's an obvious branding and communications challenge in the fact that, like, a lot of governments pivot to, let's tie funding to things that, you and your grandma can understand, right? So diabetes, dementia, these types of things, right? So, like, let's throw the money out on very tactical level that people can then connect to their daily lives, right? The broader innovation piece is sort of very 50,000 feet for a lot of people, but I think that doesn't mean that they shouldn't do it, right? Like, I do feel like there is a bit of a flying the flag piece that is definitely missing in sort of our narrative around innovation, and, like, why are we building the next generation of electric vehicles? So can we be the next, hub for, the next Shopify, as Marianne said, right? What are we doing to be a catalyst for this type of innovation, to bring jobs to the economy and bring, just be a world leader on just, like, really interesting brain stuff, right? Like, and we've kind of lost that. We've lost a bit of that plot when it comes to that bigger nation brand building. We always talk about, exporting Canadian culture abroad. That's been a massive thing for so long. And in the 90s, it was a huge deal in the UK about, cool Britannia and stuff. I think there's a bit of a branding issue around innovation in Canada, and we kind of need to tie it a bit more to Marianne's great point. We need to tie it to national identity a bit more.
Yeah, thanks for that. Shakir, Bruce, any final thoughts before we move on?
Just to pivot on, or to pile on here, I mean, it's obviously going to take a whole of government approach, both policy and investment wise, and it has been refreshing to see the government of Canada investing in laboratories and other innovation announcements in recent months. And there's going to have to be a lot more of that, but it's going to take an overall coordinated approach, and industry is absolutely going to be have to be at the table, because there's a lot of thought leadership that innovative life sciences and other sectors of the economy have that simply are not embedded in government. And so that trust-based relationship is going to be absolutely vital in order to move the sticks on this file in the way that Marianne has talked about.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to move on, guys, because I am looking at the time. Colleagues, I want to bring our viewers into a discussion that we actually had in a meeting earlier this week. And we were talking about politics in the last 10 years and how much it's actually changed. So let's go back together to the 2011 federal election. In 2011, we saw the election of a strong, stable, majority conservative government under Stephen Harper, with the NDP becoming the official opposition for the first time in Canadian history, and the Liberals pretty much left on life support. But then 4 years later, in 2015, we see the Liberals under Justin Trudeau defeat Stephen Harper, winning a majority, kicking the NDP to third place once more. And let's not forget, also within that decade, we all witnessed the election of Donald Trump and all that madness. So I want this to be a bit of a roundtable discussion, but the question is, a lot has changed in 10 years. So what has the last 10 years meant politically to you? And what do you think, stands out to you in terms of that change? Shakir, let's start with you.
I think one of the biggest things that stands out to me is the rise of misinformation, and how quickly that kind of spreads, and just exacerbates kind of partisanship. When you talk about whether it's the rise of Trump, even if you talk about what's happening domestically in Canada, I find there's a lot of political leaders who don't play by the same set of facts, if you will. They'll take numbers and fudge numbers, or they'll take numbers and fudge stories, and then they'll have their supporters kind of echo or retweet those positionings, and it just kind of divides Canadians even further, right? And now nobody's kind of dealing with the same set of information, and it increases partisanship. So I think the biggest trend that I've seen is just the ability to spread misinformation, and the unwillingness of anyone in a position of power or authority to kind of pull back that information or correct the record. And I think it's going to be very bad for our democracy and very bad for our country if this continues to go in this direction. But it's definitely a trend we're seeing in the US and Canada moving forward.
Okay, perfect. Marianne, what about you when you look at these last 10 years?
Well, there's a saying, Kaveri, that people vote governments out, they don't vote them in. And I think, it demonstrates Canadians actually quite moderate in many respects. Stephen Harper was in power for 10 years. I think you could chalk up to people wanted a change, and Trudeau certainly brought a strong change, and just, being the selfie prime minister, the way he engaged, it was a totally different brand, and Canadians were looking for that. It's interesting to see some of the different dynamics, and we haven't really talked about it on this call, but we refer to the NDP, but the Bloc Québécois is the third party in power right now. They have more seats than the NDP. And so while I think we're seeing a shift in certain parts of the country in respects to wanting more social programming and spending, there's certainly others that are, I think, now that the Liberals have been in power for 6 years or so, I think and now under a minority government, I think it's fair to say, depending on the recovery and how COVID is dealt with over the next 6 months, it's going to be a huge determinant of the next curve or turn we take in terms of identifying the kind of country we want to be and what we want to invest in and what we want to see from our political leaders.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Chris?
I think there's a couple of echoes from 2011 that are interesting. Just one's kind of very, very tactical, because I'm a nerd that way. In that, the map in 2011 changed significantly in the province of Quebec. It's now a far more kind of multicolored map than it was in the 6 elections previous, where you have some Liberal seats, you got one New Democrat seat that's hopefully going to change, and you've got the rise sort of the bloc that has now been sustained since after 2011 and after the 2015 campaign. So Quebec is still, I think, ripe for a bit of instability on the electoral map, and it's something both the Liberals and the New Democrats are going to be watching quite closely. And I think we've seen that play out as an echo of 2011. But I think we're also seeing the rise of the 905 in Ontario. It had its big sort of moment in 2011, and partially helping to hand Stephen Harper that strong, stable majority Conservative government that wasn't the case for so many years, and now 905 has become sort of the big battleground in our electoral politics, and now it was the beachhead for the Liberals to try to stave off the Conservative tides, right? And so there's that, but also there's been so many historical forces at work. I feel like sometimes I'm living like in fast forward over the last 10 years, right? So even before 2011, you had the 2008 financial crisis, which threw us into a massive recession. Just after that campaign in 2011, you've seen a generation of folks who weren't able to vote then be set back by that massive failure of policy and other things. You're now going through another cycle post-pandemic of that same generation who's now voting age and has kids, still can't buy a house, and are being set back even further by the historical forces that are far beyond their control, but also bad decisions to help sort of guard against some of these historic and market forces. So I think the electorate has kind of shifted a little bit as well in their expectations of government. I think we're still not quite sure whether or not that's going to mean we're going to go hard right, libertarian, I've got my freedom now, and let's go ahead and, get out of my way while we build a better country, or whether this is actually parked deep the belief in government as a foundational change agent in people's lives. But those two things, those tactical considerations and those historic forces, are going to be pretty interesting to see how they kind of play out in the next campaign.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Bruce, politically, what have we seen change in the last 10 years?
It's been a transformational decade, both from an operational and a machinery of campaign perspective, the way in which political parties raise money, engage with voters, get their voters out to vote, all those sorts of things. From inside the Liberal family, we view that 2011 election as the best thing that ever happened to us. A friend of mine in Ottawa always says the Liberal Party's Achilles heel is arrogance. And that event certainly beat a fair amount of it out of us. Not all, but a good chunk of it out of us. And it allowed us to recalibrate and have the sort of existential discussion about why we were here and why we cared about serving the country in the way that we do, and then doing the sorts of things that allowed us a path backward, back to having the privilege of governing the country. But the thing that has changed as well, and it's not just a last decade thing. Bill Clinton proclaimed the end of big government in the 1990s, and what is clear with this pandemic and even beforehand is that there are certain things in society, certainly in this country, where government is the only vehicle by which certain things can be done. And the pandemic has probably exacerbated that in many ways, but I don't think anyone thinks the era of big government is over. Big government is certainly back, thanks in no small part to the support of the Bank of Canada. The question is how long is it back for? It's probably not sustainable to do all the things that we're doing now in perpetuity. But the notion that important national programs that are now hopefully being started and instigated around childcare and early learning, and having those framed as economic and industrial policy, I think shows the degree to which people have in many ways accepted and turned to government to provide some of the solutions. It's not the solution to every problem that exists in society, but government is much more present in our lives, especially in the last 18 months, than probably it ever has been. At least for the time being, Canadians seem to be supporting that.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Look, panelists, we've got some really great viewer questions, so I do want to squeeze one final one in here. Marianne, why don't you pick one for us?
So here's a Canada-US question. How politically damaging to the Liberal government is the split screen Canadians are seeing of the United States opening up and vaccination powering ahead? While Canada is slipping back into lockdowns with variants circulating, we were in the opposite situation just a few months ago. So I think what that viewer is trying to say is the comparison from the Trump administration to the Biden administration and seeing the mirrored image. Thoughts from the group?
Okay, panelists, I throw it out there. Shakir, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think in the immediate term, there might be some political damage for sure. Seeing the US open up while we're going into lockdown, seeing their fast vaccination rates. But I think a lot of the responses that I've seen is, look at their mortality rates, right? They did a very, very poor job of putting in even the smallest level of restrictions, and we've done a pretty good job. We've been pretty safe as a country. As Bruce said earlier, I'm very happy to be Canadian. Even though I hate these lockdowns, these restrictions, they've kept me and my family pretty safe, so I'm very happy to be here. Over time, I think Chris pointed out that the trend in the US is not getting that second dose. So I think if in Canada, if we get our population getting that second dose, if we can achieve that herd immunity threshold, I think overall, over time, we'll probably be in a situation where we're actually looking a lot better than the US is looking right now. But I think the immediate contrast for Trudeau, yeah, it doesn't look good that the US is opening up, the US is hosting sporting events, and we're just not there yet. But I think even as a conservative, time is on the Liberal side with this one. And I look at some of the provinces saying, end of May or even mid-June, almost every adult who wants a vaccine will have one. Again, the wind will be back in the sails of the federal government. We have our shipments, millions and millions per week. We have people who are lining up to get vaccinations. And look, it's summertime, sun is out, people are happy. Again, temporary issues for the Liberals, not a good position to be in right now. But again, the long term, the long game is on their side.
Yeah, agree with you, right? Put it into perspective, really. Bruce, do you want to take a stab at this one really quickly?
Well, I think the short answer to the question is not very politically damaging at all. The truth of the matter is we have every reason to think that we're going to outstrip the Americans in the next month or two in terms of the percentage of the population that have been vaccinated. Speaking to friends and watching coverage in the United States, vaccines are a political issue in the United States in a way that they are not in Canada. Masks are a political issue in the way that they are not in Canada. The question presupposes that states like Texas weren't opening up anyway, regardless of the state of vaccination, because you have, a set of circumstances where the responsibility of citizenship is cast aside in places in the United States. And in Canada, we don't view these sorts of things as an infringement of our personal liberty. We're all trying to do the best we can because we've got this long and proud tradition of peace, order, and good government. And, there's 38 million of us on this big piece of geography all trying to get along together. And that sense of cohesion that exists more so in Canada than America, I think, is the thing that protects us an awful lot during this difficult time that we're going through.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Colleagues, we're almost out of time, but I do want to get to this new segment I'm trying out. So, I know during these webinars, I usually pick the topics, steer the conversations, but before we go, I want you to tell me what has caught your eye in this past month. And I'm trying to call this segment, What Were They Thinking? And of course, this can be on any topic you want to, that has raised your eyebrows this month. So Chris, I'm going to let you start us off. This month, what were they thinking?
Hey, MLB, Major League Baseball, what were you thinking? So this is a little bit of an under the radar story. So there's a guy named Daniel Kim. Daniel Kim has been one of the most vocal advocates for Major League Baseball in Korea since like the mid 90s. He has built this massive online platform on Twitter, on YouTube, on various specific Korean social channels. Like, he has done more for Major League Baseball to expand the love of that sport in what should be a strategic market for that sport than anybody. Flew to America recently to cover a bunch of different games, including, I think, the Jays Yankees series, applied for official credentials, and then was denied official credentials to be a journalist covering things for MLB. So what were you thinking, MLB? Because, and this is kind of a message to all brands, like, work with your community, don't work against your community. Don't apply your stringent rules to try to control your message, because it never works. A guy like Daniel Kim should be one of your biggest assets to actually grow the game in a market that has rabid baseball fans everywhere. So let that be a lesson to most brands out there. Don't push against your community, collaborate with them, work with them. It'll help you.
Totally agree, Chris. What were they thinking? All right, Marianne, your pick.
Mine has certainly got to be the sexual misconduct that's been taking place in the military. Here we are again. Pleased to see the defense minister appoint former Supreme Court Judge Louise Arbour for the review, but there's got to be some serious thinking in the military about changing these dynamics, because this review is coming 3 months nearly after these complainants. And I would say very boldly, capital letters, what are you thinking?
Perfect. Thank you. Shakir?
Yeah, mine would have to be the announcement of the Ford government about 2 weeks ago to give the police a range of authorities just to stop people and stop vehicles trying to police their way out of COVID-19. The Science Advisory Table gave them a range of recommendations, whether it's paid sick days, whether it was narrowing the list of essential businesses, and they chose to ignore all those recommendations and pursue policies that nobody asked for. So what were they thinking?
Totally agree. Bruce, you got last word on this.
Well, I'm thinking of our neighboring province, Alberta. Jason Kenney, what was he thinking? You know, straddling two horses, one lockdowns and health measures and individual liberties. It's a tough spot to be in. And it reminds me of that old Churchillian quote about the Americans, which is, they always do the right thing, but only after every alternative has been exhausted.
Okay, perfect. Well, guys, I think you've, confirmed to me that I think we're going to keep this segment. What were they thinking? I loved your answers. Thank you. Colleagues, this is our time. To all of you, thanks again for taking the time to join our political strategy panel. A big thank you to our viewers for joining us as well. We will be back here again next month. If you have any further questions on anything you have heard on today's webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to us through our website, earnscliffe.ca. Also, I do want to flag that our colleague Alan Gregg will be back towards the middle of May with a special webinar on Canadian federalism and what the future holds. So you won't want to miss that one. And until I see you again next month, stay safe. And if you haven't already, get vaccinated. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks, everybody.